Welcome to On What Slender Threads. This is Tradition 2. My name is Lynn. This presentation is based on a book that I wrote, On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it's not necessary to buy the book unless you'd like to have it as a resource. It is my hope that these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying research on AA's early history from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, and from the experiences and insights of AA friends around the world, but most importantly, from research on AA's early history. I am not a spokesperson for AA. Any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. Now, I like to start with a preamble that fits the tradition for each presentation. So for the second tradition, I chose Concept 1. The final responsibility and ultimate authority for AA World Services should always reside in the collective conscience of our fellowship, from the AA Service Manual. In the previous presentation, we explored Tradition 1. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. Bill writes in his essay that the structure of our society was hammered out so that AA groups can live and work together. That structure is the General Service structure that relies on a General Service Conference committee of representatives from AA. Those committees help groups to solve problems and shape policy for AA worldwide. The traditions were Bill's pathway to creating a General Service Conference, and the conference ended up encouraging groups' acceptance of the traditions. Or to say it another way, I believe that Bill wrote the 12 points to facilitate selling the idea of a conference to the groups. The fellowship had to have been reassured that those points were the guidelines that the conference would have to follow. Over time, the standards set for the conference seemed reasonable for individual groups. So now it's time to explore decision-making by the group, whether the group is the conference committee, intergroup committees, or individual groups. This was also the only time that Bill's original point is shorter than the tradition. So if you can imagine, Bill was peddling the points and the conference for several years with resistance from older fellowship members and the trustees. When he returned with the encouragement of Earl T., he decided to write the shorter form for easier digestion by the groups. Well, for some very strange reason, he made the point for Tradition 2 longer. In Tradition 2, he says, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. He added, our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why did he feel compelled to add that? Well, let's take a look at Bill's essay. I want to highlight a few points. He asks, where does AA get its direction? Who runs it? When told that our society has no president having authority to govern it, no treasurer who can compel the payment of dues, no board of directors, no AA can give another a directive and enforce obedience, our friends gasp and exclaim, this simply can't be. Well, then he says, these practical points then read Tradition 2 and learn that the sole authority in AA is the loving God as he may express himself in the group conscience. And as Bill will continually mention in his essays, there were always people pushing back saying that these alcoholics aren't going to be able to follow these guidelines. It's just not going to work. So he adds in this essay, the friends mutter and say, this looks vague, nebulous, pretty naive to to them, then they commence to watch us with speculative eyes. He goes on to give an example of the problems that leaders impose on AA groups. He talks about a group in Middletown, USA, which was actually a group in Charleston, West Virginia. He says a person has gotten sober and Middletown now has a group and he's the boss. And at this moment, he is a benign dictator and becomes a chairman of committee composed of his friends. And they decide that it would be a good idea to keep a firm hand on AA in this town. But groups grow, and with growth come growing pains. And members start saying, do these old-timers think they can run this group forever? Let's have an election. And now you're starting to hear Bill write about what he envisions for the conference, electing delegates to the conference. The revolution is on. The group conscience is about to take over. He goes on to talk about a rotating committee, a chairperson, public relations, treasurer, literature, phone answering services, simple services that enable the group to function. He's describing what he envisions could happen with the conference. And he assures AA members that the committee gives no spiritual advice, judges no one's conduct, issues no orders. Thus, throughout, AA does the group conscience decree the terms upon which its leaders will serve. Then he talks about the elder statesman compared to the bleeding deacon. And he says the elder statesman is the one who sees the wisdom of the group's decision, whose judgment fortified by considerable experience is sound, and who's willing to sit quietly on the sidelines, patiently awaiting development. He's trying to model good, trusted servantship. On the alternative, we have the bleeding deacon, the one who's convinced that the group cannot get along without him, who constantly connives for re-election, and who continues to be consumed with self-pity. But ultimately, he hopes the elder statesman becomes the real and permanent leadership of AA, and that bleeding deacons will hopefully become elder statespeople. Theirs is the quiet opinion, the sure knowledge, and the humble example that they resolve a crisis. They do not drive by mandate. They lead by example. So in his essay, Settling the Leadership Problem for AA Groups, he goes on to talk about the self-sacrifice required when alcoholics come together to have a group conscience. He knows that, like himself, there will be alcoholics who believe that they know what should happen in the group conscience, and they'll steer it just so things turn out their way. So he talks about a job offer he got from Towns Hospital, Charlie, who said, "You should be paid for this work. Let me set up an office for you." Well, at the time, Bill and Lois were impoverished, and he resisted at first, but then he had a few twinges of conscience, and he started thinking that Charlie's proposal was ethical. And here comes a flash of divine guidance. It's almost a cautionary tale to people who believe they have the answer for the group conscience. But he puts it before the group conscience, and he says, the group says that you can never become a professional. As generous as Charlie has been to us, don't you see that we can't tie this thing up with his hospital or any other? Sure, it's ethical, but what we've got won't run on ethics only. Sometimes the good, Bill closes with, is the enemy of the best. And he says, so spoke the group conscience. Here was the true voice welling up out of my friends. Bill is speaking to the importance of self-sacrifice, setting aside our own needs and being willing to listen with an open mind to the group. Well, when a newcomer comes to a group conscience or to a business meeting and there's one person yelling at the other person or someone trying to ramrod a decision, they're bound to ask, who's in charge around here? Which makes the first phrase of this tradition vitally important. For our group purpose. I mean, for me, for so long, it was almost a throwaway phrase. But now I realize that for our group purpose was incredibly important to the traditions. If we could just reflect, for our group purpose ensures AA's unity and protects the common welfare of its members. It is what binds the first tradition to the second tradition, and for that matter, every tradition is for our group purpose, particularly if we think of the group of the AA fellowship. Knowing what I know now, the second tradition was Bill's anchor for unity for all AA groups. And I learned from tradition one that the group referred to the fellowship. Bill's dream was for all groups to lead AA, not individuals. But if inclusivity was Bill's intent, I had to wonder, why did he say a loving God in that tradition? Why not a loving higher power? Well, to better understand why, it helped me to trace Bill's own spiritual progression. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about Bill's hot flash or white light experience. Was it sparked by belladonna treatments or DTs? It doesn't much matter, does it? Whatever it was, it's clear that something life-changing happened to Bill. And in order to maintain that life-changing event, he went forward to carry the message to others. And while he was writing the big book, he peppered the manuscript with Christian references that were familiar to him and Dr. Bob. It makes perfect sense. Bill had a life-changing spiritual alteration, and he quite naturally gravitated to the literature of his culture and time. So all of us should say, thank goodness for Hank P., Hank Parkhurst, and Jim B., Jim Burwell. They argued and insisted that Bill needed to temper his dogma and use less God and more higher power or God of one's own understanding. But interestingly enough, Bill stubbornly resisted making changes to his text. The book was reaching the finish line, getting close to publication, and Hank was desperately trying to get Bill to be reasonable. So Hank invites Dr. Howard in to review the draft. Dr. Howard was intrigued by the draft, but he said it's too dogmatic. It's got too many musts. You have to get rid of the pervasive use of biblical phraseology. Well, according to Jim B., disaster nearly overtook us, for it threw Bill into a terrific mental uproar to have his baby pulled apart by an outside screwball psychiatrist who, in his opinion, knew nothing about alcoholism. So it was clear that Bill wasn't budging until Hank threatened him with a committee of fellowship members to review the manuscript. Well, this is akin to having a group conscience. So the undesirable prospect of a group conscience forced Bill to relent 17 days before the pre-publication manuscript went to press. He frantically started replacing the mandate-oriented text with prose that was more suggestive and counterbalanced some of his Christian language with allowances for spiritual pathways. Well, we all know some, but not all. Bill's Christian references continued into 1953, well after the big book had been written, with the publication of the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Bill less than half-heartedly tried to be more inclusive in his essay on the second step when he said, relieved of the alcohol obsession, their lives unaccountably transformed, they came to believe in a higher power, and most of them began to talk of God. In his essay on the 12th step, Bill went back to his old ways and said that the doubter who still considered his well-loved AA group the higher power would presently love and call him by name. Now, specific to this discussion on the second tradition, Bill invoked the ultimate authority of a loving God rather than the more generic loving higher power. Now, I'm not able to ask him about it now, but one could surmise that he was using the word God generically, like so many of us do in our shares. But I don't know, call him by name? I think he was still pretty fixed in his idea that there was a God of his understanding that AAs would drift toward. It would be years before Bill would concede that atheists and agnostics were staying sober through their own spiritual pathways. In a 1961 Grapevine article, The Dilemma of No Faith, he wrote about the unconscious arrogance that God, as Bill understood him, had to be the same for everyone else. Well, at least to me, that article still had a condescending tone toward everyone else. But at least Bill had clearly come to terms with the dangers of driving struggling alcoholics away when by 1965 he wrote, "We have atheists and agnostics. We have people of nearly every race, culture, and religion. In AA, we are supposed to be bound together in the kinship of a common suffering." Bill then continued with an admonishment for the fellowship and maybe perhaps for himself when he said, "Let us not therefore pressure anyone with our individual or even our collective views." Ironically, Bill was frustrated by the fellowship's enshrinement of the Big Book, which was the primary reason he wrote the 1953 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. It had been over 10 years since the Big Book first came out, and Bill and others had actually worked the 12 steps by then. He desperately wanted to say more about the steps, but he could not overcome members' objections to making even the smallest edits to the Big Book. 8 years after the publication of the 12 and 12, he revisited this same frustration by saying, "As time passes, our book literature has a tendency to get more and more frozen, a tendency for conversion into something like dogma." Now, did that mean that Bill might have tempered his Christian references if he'd been given the opportunity? I want to say probably not. At over 18 years sober and through his own spiritual pursuits, Bill believed he had evidence that God existed. Fortunately, he practiced restraint and did not share his belief with the general fellowship, which is again why we owe so much to Hank P. and Jim B. Because of their tenacity, we have a disclaimer in the Big Book that we can apply to this tradition. When, therefore, we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. And of course, many thanks go to the first 2,000 members who read the Big Book and said, "What are you talking about, a white light experience? What are you saying?" To which Bill had to respond in the second printing of the first edition in 1941 with the spiritual experience of the educational variety. He wrote he finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. With few exceptions, our members find that they've tapped in an unsuspected inner resource which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. Well, so at the end of the day, please remember that Bill's intention in the second tradition was for the group conscience to be a spiritual experience, for AAs to come together and bring their understanding of spirituality and the God in each one see the God in the other, and be able to come together and solve problems using their principles. I mean, maybe we should call it the group spiritual experience. Now, practicing the first tradition's principles of unity and common welfare, all members of a group should take a moment to acknowledge the authority that's derived from their combined spiritual understanding as they begin the group conscience. Well, this is only going to work well if no one is trying to dominate the discussion. What is a group's best defense from leaders who would be leaders rather than trusted servants? Bill struggled with this question at multiple levels. Well, alcoholics do seem to have problems with authorities and rules. Dealing with disinterested and apathetic groups led Bill to follow Earl T's advice to condense and give another name to the 12 points. Remember, Earl's the one that withheld his story in the first edition of the Big Book. But Earl eventually came around to supporting Bill and being wonderful in terms of giving advice. Bill wisely, with Earl's urging, avoided laws, rules, bylaws, or regulations, knowing the fellowship would reject any code that reflected a heavy authoritarian hand. Thus he chose traditions. However, as much as alcoholics abhor authoritarians, no one loves being an authority more than alcoholics. Bill's observations while on the road in 1946, 47, and 48, and while responding to groups' problems at headquarters, probably inspired him to expand the second point to include, our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. And to spend a portion of his essay talking about the founder who becomes the leader, who may regress to a bleeding deacon, but after practicing principles evolves to be the elder statesman. But I can't help but wonder whether he was also taking aim at the foundation's trustees who were resisting the idea of a conference of delegates. Nonetheless, Bill knew that the intoxicating allure of leader tempted many in the fellowship. So let's back up to the founder who becomes a leader. Problems with power and prestige. No one would dispute that Bill was clearly AA's founder. From the moment he got sober to when he met Dr. Bob, through when the fellowship grew, before and after the Big Book, Bill devoted every ounce of energy into the fellowship. He could see its potential for reaching alcoholics all over the world, and if there were alcoholics on Mars, he would have looked in that direction as well. His obsession made him AA's leader. And when leaders die, the rush to replace them is on. Therefore, he knew that co-founder implies co-leader. And Bill contributed to the problem of people who felt like they were co-founders by giving credit to many people. He talked about the ego inflation when he jokingly talked about he even considered calling AA the BW movement. He was kidding, but he would go out on the road and distill his own importance by giving credit to lots of people, including William James, Dr. William Silkworth, Reverend Sam Shoemaker, Dr. Bob, Sister Ignatia, all who should get credit for our early beginnings. But it was a fun story to tell as he was taking AA's founding story on the road. Now, Akron was where Bill met Dr. Bob and where the third alcoholic got sober. So it's easy to see why the Akronites felt that AA's origins belonged there. Even Henrietta Seiberling felt that she deserved as much recognition as others were getting, and after all, she brought Bill and Dr. Bob together. And Clarence S. spearheaded such remarkable growth in Cleveland that many thought AA started there. And he did form the first group named Alcoholics Anonymous. There were other people who could be considered co-founders had they not drank. Ebby T. was Bill's heartbreak. He had really hoped that Ebby T., who he called his sponsor until Ebby died, would stay sober, but Ebby couldn't do that. And of course, shortly after the Big Book was published, his friend Hank Parkhurst drank. So ultimately, the last man standing was Dr. Bob. And ironically, Dr. Bob never tried to jockey for recognition. In an attempt to lessen his own visibility, Bill modified the story of the creation of AA to sound like 100 men and women had actually created the book. Those on-the-road yarns purposefully amplified early members' role in writing the basic text and diminished his own leadership role to one of being a trusted servant. In an indirect way, the Big Book story was a vehicle for encouraging groups to rely on group consciences rather than individuals for their decisions. Bill wanted the leadership to belong to the fellowship, not to an individual nor to a group of individuals, and this rested, he believed, on the effectiveness of the group conscience. That is why the essay emphasizes the importance of individual self-sacrifice in a true group conscience. After all, Bill could have been a paid lay therapist at Towns Hospital. There had been no precedent set for it yet. It's easy to see why he considered it. He and Lois were desperate for money. And whether Bill did this consciously or not, this story for the second tradition contains a moral for all AAs. That the group conscience is a commitment to be willing to sacrifice individual wants and needs. But it was also a trial by fire moment for the group conscience. It could have fit beautifully in the eighth tradition that AA will never be professional. As Schaberg said, who knows what would have happened to AA's philosophy of 12-step work freely given if Bill had accepted this job offer? Well, this was a time for Bill to honor the group conscience, and Bill did rely on group consciences very early on, but there were some that he worked around. For example, the early fellowship resisted the idea of selling the Big Book. They said, wasn't selling the Big Book professionalizing 12-step work? In this case, Bill did overrule the group conscience, recognizing the group's intent, but also acknowledging that the group could be wrong. Revenues would be needed to answer the flood of inquiries, and he was experiencing that directly at headquarters. And he knew by then that he would have to devote most of his time to helping AA through its early adolescence. So, as Pass It On says, Bill was selective, using only those experiences that went to the heart of AA's problems. Since his desire was always in the best interest of AA, his so-called manipulations always worked for the good of the fellowship. Well, his own maneuverings notwithstanding, Bill kept his eye on the prize. AA's common welfare and unity were possible only by reliance on the group rather than reliance on an individual, especially himself. However, Bill demonstrated an inordinate faith in his own judgment when he said at one point, "My personal life may not be exemplary, but I have never made a mistake about AA." Well, in fact, he did occasionally make mistakes, and so did the trustees of the foundation early on. At heart, he must have known this, given his desire to take decision-making out of his own hands or out of the hands of a few people and hand the decision-making over to the groups. When Bill was peddling the points, he had a much larger purpose in mind. Bill was promoting his dream for AA to have a structure of elected, trusted servants from the AA groups who would steer AA's course. The conundrum was that these overly reliant groups were at the same time resistant to the suggestions given by the foundation and headquarters. Given groups had no say in crafting those suggestions, Bill feared groups would lose interest and become disenfranchised from the trustees and headquarters. Even with this argument, early members and the trustees were unimpressed. They were saying, no, 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 no conference. Bill argued that the foundation would ultimately lose AA groups if they were not included in these important discussions. Why should groups in other states care about decisions made by an unknown and remote group of non-alcoholic trustees in New York? Still, the trustees resisted. Now, Bill did admit to using sledgehammer tactics. one of which was a letter that he wrote in which he said, "When I was in law school, the largest book I studied was the one on trust. I must say, gentlemen, that it was mostly a long and melancholy account of the malfeasances and misfeasances of boards of trustees." Well, clearly, this was a demonstration of an immature alcoholic not getting his way. And it wasn't the last temper tantrum that Bill would throw. Bill was ashamed of this outburst, of course. He said, "I had written to a group of the best friends I had in the world, people who had devoted themselves to AA and to me without stint. Obviously, I was on a dry bender of the worst possible sort." Finally, trustees Leonard Harrison and Bernard Smith compromised and convinced the Alcoholic Foundation to give the annual conference a 5-year test run. In April 1951, the first General Service Conference met in New York City. The theme, "Not to govern, but to serve." Bill said about a third of the delegates were real old-timers, and the rest were active members sober 4 to 8 years. He went on to say, "We all sensed something momentous was happening, that this was a historic moment. The delegates inspected AA's finances and listened to reports from the Board of Trustees and from all of the services. There was warm but cordial debate on many questions of AA policy." Thus began transparency in AA affairs. Bill continued that the trustees submitted several of their own serious problems for the opinion of the conference. With real dispatch, the delegates handled several tough puzzlers about which we at headquarters were in doubt. Though their advice was sometimes contrary to our own views, we saw they were frequently right. The first delegates laid the groundwork for an informed group conscience, one that included background research and allowed all views, including the minority opinion. Bill concluded, "They were proving as never before our group conscience could safely act as the sole authority and sure guide for Alcoholics Anonymous." As the delegates returned home, they carried this deep conviction with them. It was at this first trial run that the delegates proposed changing the name of the Alcoholic Foundation to the General Service Board. This recommendation and the General Service Conference structure of Alcoholics Anonymous was formally approved in 1955. So began a seismic shift in how AA shaped policy through that 5-year, really 4 years that they met before it was approved, test run of the annual General Service Conference. In keeping with the second tradition, delegates are not leaders, but trusted servants of their respective areas' AA groups. Furthermore, the conference continues to rely on a loving higher power as expressed by the delegates' collective group conscience. In short, the conference is the AA group's group conscience for the United States and Canada. The conference was only a fractional part, though, of giving responsibility for AA to alcoholics. At that time, the majority of trustees was still non-alcoholic. Bill believed that his full dream would not be achieved until AA members comprised a majority of the trustees. So what about the frozen texts? Well, the conference was helpful in responding to society changes with pamphlets and literature that addressed evolving issues in race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender differences, spiritual variances, age, whether younger or older, problems other than alcohol, and many other problems. The timeliness and the effectiveness of every pamphlet depends upon AA members' careful involvement, their careful use of these materials, and their careful study. All of the pamphlets are subject to revisions and updates recommended by the conference. You can scan them on the General Service Office Literature Catalog website. If you identified a need or you have recommendations for changes to existing pamphlets, contact your General Service representative to raise this issue. So, what is the group's best defense from leaders who would be trusted servants, from trusted servants who would be leaders rather than trusted servants? Well, maybe this is partly resolved by an informed group conscience. What is an informed AA group conscience? Well, if you take a look at the AA group pamphlet, it is the sharing of full information, individual points of view, and the practice of AA's principles. Bring that pamphlet with you to a group conscience. Do background research, check your resources, review the traditions, contact the General Service Office. It is the collective conscience of the group. It is the willingness to listen to minority opinions with open minds. It is the willingness to work slowly until a collective view emerges and to be wary of dominant opinions. It is truly the spiritual expression of the group. So coming up in the next presentation on the third tradition, the AA group pamphlet also provides the information needed to join an AA group. The only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. That's tradition 3. And also, thus, group membership requires no formal application. Just as we are members of AA if we say we are, so are we members of a group if we say we are. Well, we will learn in Tradition 3 that the road to that very simple requirement was long and rocky. For comments and questions, or if you want to be on the mailing list for upcoming workshops, please email me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. For other resources and workshop flyers, see www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you so much.